We're now many months into running these shows. We run these shows, the Dare Greatly Space podcast. We've been doing them since October. It's now June, so there's a lot of these. We do them every twice a week, every Monday and Wednesday. Yeah, there's some days that we miss, but typically Mondays and Wednesdays, going on 8 months now. It's been great. We've had some amazing guests, some amazing experiences. We've got some cool stuff coming up here. As a recap, Andy Aldrin has been on. He's terrific. Roger Lanius. Andy Aldrin is the son of Buzz Aldrin and a bona fide space badass in his own right. So definitely worth listening to that one. Roger Lanius, we've had 2 episodes with him. He is the former chief historian of NASA and the associate administrator of the Air and Space Museum, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. We've really had some tremendous guests. Coming up soon, we've got the deputy administrator Lori Garver of NASA, former of NASA. We've got Dr. Joel Mosier, the chief scientist of U.S. Space Force, and Dr. Stephen Quast, 3-star Air Force general that was pretty instrumental in the creation of Space Force. So just some amazing stuff that we've already done and we've got coming up. To put an exclamation point on that, our current guest today, Sean Mahoney, has been on our show twice now. Once in his guise as a battered and bruised, but still doing the job, former president of NASA and Aerospace, and then in his current role as the executive director and board chair of the Space Frontier Foundation. So without pulling any of his thunder, I'm going to let him talk about some of the stuff that he's doing. We're pretty excited about this next step with the Space Frontier Foundation. Let me add that our client where we host the Red Planet Live series for the Mars Society, that's been going really great. We've got probably some interesting announcements coming up here in a few weeks for that. And I think that's kind of it for updates. The biggest one, I'm going to let Sean go ahead and make his announcement. So Sean, let's bring you on. Hey, sir, welcome back to the show. It's been fun.
Thank you. Glad to be here. With it 2 more till I can get the official jacket as a
there's a jersey and a punch card
jersey.
Okay. for a free latte. Yeah, yep. But that's 5. Awesome. You have to get all 5. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're getting there slowly, but glad to be back and glad to talk with you and everyone else again.
Yeah. So let's we're going to talk about a couple things tonight. You got an announcement that I think it's kind of a big deal. We'll talk a little bit about that. You just came back from ISDC, International Space Development Conference. There was some interesting stuff about the conference, and then also some of the stuff that you got as the leader of the Space Frontier Foundation. So let's jump in first with the news, and let's talk about what just happened, an hour ago.
Yeah, this will be great. So for just in case you've got some new folks that aren't familiar with the Space Frontier Foundation, this is an organization that has been around for many, many years, was a outgrowth of the L5 Society that then merged in with the National Space Society and then grew out of the National Space Society. It's an organization of people dedicated to opening the space frontier to human settlement as rapidly as possible. And definitely takes as its inspiration the Gerard K. O'Neill view of commercial, human commercial practices that will then release the value that is in space for people that are in space and also people that are down on Earth. So over the last several months since we last spoke here, the organization's been
You were
taking
one
the
of our
time.
first guests, so that would have been maybe November, December,
Yeah.
perhaps. Yeah.
And we're in June. I
What
had to look
happened?
to figure out what but the board and then broader group within the organization have been taking the time to look at the situation of where the space industry is today and figuring out where are the biggest gaps that can be filled to serve that objective of advancing human settlement of space. And one of the things that we realized is that as people are coming into this industry, a lot of times we don't have a great way of explaining a lot of the work that came before. We have stories about the space program, but stories about the space industry are sometimes a little harder to come by. And so we realized that we needed to capture some of those stories about the pioneers of new space in a way that can be shared and communicated to folks as they're joining the industry. And I got to be honest, even for me,
Right.
there's still things that I'm learning about the challenges and the toils and the trials and tribulations that people went through in order to open up this opportunity for us. So the conversation
I
that we
learned something an hour ago. I mean,
Yes.
I've been at this for 20 years. You've been at it for a long time. I learned something an hour ago. So yeah.
and it is both fascinating and relevant. It's not just, it's cool stories. And there's plenty of cool stories about dealing with difficulties, but understanding how we got to where we are today and what it took is really kind of the interesting thing. So what we're doing is a series of conversations with some of those space pirates, some of the pioneers, some of the folks that were in it, and that were not just talking about space or a fan of space, that were actually in the industry and doing the work and taking the arrows that cracked open our country's approach to space to create the fertile ground for the companies that we now know and look to for them to take root. Because once you start to get an idea of some of the history, you realize that there have been multiple iterations. It's not, I don't want to go full Neo and like multiple iterations going through, but there have been we've seen this sort of thing before. And so I'm excited that we're going to have some of these conversations to share with a broad audience to be kind of a primer for folks as they're getting involved in the industry, so they can get a sense of what work was done, how it was done, and how they can pick that same sort of thing up and make sure we're adding to it. So
it's a combination of, a little bit of taking credit, because I think the foundation deserves to take some credit, but that's not the point of it. The point of it is to understand the past so that you can navigate the future better, right? It's not just sitting around the campfire singing Kumbaya and rehashing the good old days, because they weren't that good for some of us, right? They were hard, they were difficult, they were painful. Our guest a moment ago, and we'll describe that in a second. I know we're kind of burying the lead there. Our guest a moment ago got literal death threats, right? So, these are real people who no joke, hyperbole aside, we're the ones who were in the room, making the deals, getting, some backstabbed experiences. And we wouldn't be here in this, robust beginnings of what, the new space frontier is that we're all kind of, we all kind of have come to take for granted that SpaceX and Blue and Relativity and Astra and all of the other companies that are doing great work, literally dozens of rocketry companies, hundreds of satellite companies, we all kind of take that for granted, but that was not possible in 1988 when the Space Frontier Foundation started. No. It was not possible, and I don't use the word impossible lightly. So let's talk about what this Pioneers show experience is going to look like. What do you want to say, and then I'll add some stuff.
Well, the main part of it here is to help us understand not just what happened, but how did it come to happen, and what were the things that enabled it to happen, and how did people make some of those decisions. And while the big battles or the big outcomes or the final vote on the floor and those sorts of things are interesting, mm-hmm. for those of us that are going to be the doers and active in the industry, we need more than just a story of what eventually happened, and more of that story about how it was made and what went into getting to the point that you can have the chance to win or lose. And I quote Teddy Roosevelt's "Man in the Arena" on a regular basis. And this is, to a certain degree, what does it take to get in the arena?
Oh, so I love that. I mean, that's why we've named our show the Dare Greatly Show in the first place, because that really speaks to us. So thank you for that. That's terrific. Doug, we've got a comment in the chat here. Dr. Plata is asking, to what extent can the early Space Frontier Foundation pioneers take credit for SpaceX and Blue Origin? Would those guys have done what they did if SFF hadn't existed? Sean, I'm going to let you answer in your way. I'm going to answer also. I am not a 1988 pioneer. I was in the U.S. Marine Corps. I was 21 years old in 1988. I was not looking at space. So this is the 35th anniversary of the Space Frontier Foundation. And it wasn't at a Space Frontier Foundation meeting. It was at a Mars Society meeting that I met Elon Musk. And it was 2002, springtime 2002. That was the first time I met Musk. And he was just another nerd in a room full of nerds. But the Mars Society, Space Frontier Foundation, and SFF all originated in roughly the same time zones. I just learned an hour ago that National Space Society predates most of them, starting in 1974. But all of those organizations influenced both SpaceX and Blue. And I know, Sean, you have a story about Musk and Blue and O'Neill. So tell that story.
So, yeah, as part of the Space Frontier Foundation, I'm going to go ahead and use the large net to kind of encapsulate the space advocacy over the years. There's some that are specific in Space Frontier, but there's a lot of related organizations. Going back into the 70s, you have the L5 Society and the National Space Institute. Those two organizations had different approaches, but merged together to create the National Space Society. And then a few years after the merger, then the Space Frontier Foundation splits off. That's a story you're going to have to tune in separately to hear how that went down. But the work of the L5 Society and National Space Society and its predecessors was important in carrying the O'Neillian vision of how we were going to capture value from space, and to the point of actually defeating an international treaty in, I believe, 1980. There was a moon treaty that the U.S. is not party to, and it would not have been favorable to a commercial free market footing. And so that's an early one that we can point to, and that predates the foundation, but it's the same.
But it was those same people that created the foundation.
The subsequent work of the Space Frontier Foundation in pushing not just the concept of the O'Neillian commercial space future, but making sure that it wasn't just swept under the rug. It's a fact of business that business interests may want to protect their interests, and without any counterpoint, there was a threat to our space future of companies that wanted to deny that there would be anything other than a state-sponsored space program. And that's where some of the work of the Space Frontier Foundation in changing that opinion and actually putting into law changes that mandated that the federal government not prohibit companies from forming. And so those things obviously tilled the ground, but the direct connection of O'Neill to Musk and Bezos and many others planted those seeds far before those companies ever sprouted. So, the influence is large, and I can tell you, I came in a little bit after that particular phase, but I can tell you that since then, the people that are in the room for the Space Frontier Foundation events are the people who then are finding a way to give actual life to these principles of free enterprise.
Doug, let me answer a little bit more specific. Would have been, 2012, maybe 2011, maybe 2013. The folks that are now nanoracks, maybe it was 2008. It was a while ago. They went to a Space Frontier Foundation meeting, hanging out. They've known each other for a long time. Mamber was a part of the original MirCorp back when Tomlinson and Michael, whatever, I can't think of his last name all of a sudden. Those folks were all trying to get a commercial space station put together under MirCorp. That did not work. Fast forward, I think it was maybe 2007, 2008. Mamber and a bunch of his team were at the Space Frontier Foundation meeting having a beer. There's a lot of beer at SFF meetings. There's a lot of beer. I'm sorry to say, but it's definitely a social lubricant. And that's how nanoracks came to exist. So fast forward to them creating Starlab. That was a specific direct result of the Space Frontier Foundation, arguably either the second or the first best space station development in the field. I might put them second behind Axiom, although I think there's good reason for them to be number one. And I would say maybe Gravitics is a close third, and there's a couple others. But we can all point to companies that sprang up out of the existence of Space Frontier Foundation. So as a longtime advocate, I'm a fan, but there's been real world results, demonstratable results.
Which would be a great reason to tune in and hear some of the people that were doing these things provide that context of what they thought needed to happen and how they decided to go about making it.
So very specifically, the show that we're building, Liftport's really happy, DareGreatly, and our media brand, Better Futures, is building a program, a series for the Space Frontier Foundation. It's going to be 10 episodes. They're short. They're not this long rambly thing like we do here. They're short. They're going to get cut down to just 15 minutes, but it's going to be 15 minutes of solid gold. So 10 episodes of 15 minutes each. Our source material is an hour-long conversation with the people who were there in the room, the ones that gave congressional testimony, the ones that wrote up op-ed pieces, the ones that got in trouble and got fired for their positions that they took. So we're interviewing between 12 and 15 people. We're going to have a lot of different topics. I'm not going to do the spoiler on telling you what the topics are just yet. But these are people that were in the room doing it. And anybody who's watched our show knows we look at the policy, that intersection of space policy, space infrastructure, and space finance. So that's what the show is going to be about. Internally, we've been referring to it as the Pioneers episodes. I don't know that that's what's going to be the final result, the final name or tag. That hasn't been decided. But it's really resonated with us and our team. And what we're going to do is we'll release the final version towards the end of summer, middle summer, something like that. We've got some pretty hard deadlines that are going to be difficult for us to reach, but we've got some hard deadlines. And we are going to air the raw programs in their unedited version straight, and we're going to start releasing those starting Tuesdays. So our show, DareGreatly Space, is Monday and Wednesday, and then in the middle, we're going to have the combination of the client, Red Planet Live and Mars Society, and Space Frontier Foundation's Pioneers program. So that's going to be running on Tuesdays. Those will all be the Pioneers ones will all be pre-recorded. Red Planet Live will still be live. So that's what's coming up over the next couple months. So that should be pretty fun. I'm really excited about it. And Sean, what would you say some goals would be for doing this? Right? We're not doing this to do navel gazing. Like you, in your role as the president, you in your role as the executive director, you want to get something out of this. What are you trying to get to?
Well, there's two pieces to it. One is to improve the level of understanding of what went into creating the world that we live in today. Mm-hmm. That understanding is great and it's helpful. it is the application of that understanding to today that I'm
Right.
really hoping that we get out of this.
This is not an academic exercise. There is a result that you need out of this.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Great.
And not that I'm going to form the narrative of the past just to fit it, but that's the narrative that I want to make sure that we are able to pick up, because for those that are in this industry, it can be difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding how people have dealt with that difficulty through recent history will help inform those of us who are in it, trying to carry things forward. And the other piece of that is the understanding that we have an obligation to this greater good. We still have work to do for the industry to be able to benefit all of humanity. A lot of that may come from our service as, a civil servant. It may come from our role in a for-profit company, but there are still some things that don't fit in either of those camps. And as leaders in the industry, we have a responsibility to make sure that we are setting up that fertile ground for the future, not just planting and harvesting the ground that was set up for us before, but also making sure that we are doing the work that is over the horizon, that is not going to be captured by any of our companies necessarily today, but that will be the enabler of those companies that will come in the future.
You're trying to so some people have argued that the Space Frontier Foundation has done its job and move on to the next, people are like, look, you guys were the commercial champions, checkbox, we've got commercial, right? What do we need the Space Frontier Foundation for anymore? So what you're really saying is, what is the raison d'etre of the Space Frontier Foundation going forward?
Yeah. And to those who said the Space Frontier Foundation was about commercial space industry, and I'll take some responsibility for not framing that as a critical step towards this objective rather than the objective itself. And that's where, and I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of people that have come into the industry that had that perception that it was, all right, we're here to foster commercial space. It was commercial space in service to opening the frontier. And so success in that piece, making sure that it's been able to kind of catch. And there's other people, other stakeholders that are better suited to facilitating all of the needs of commercial space companies. Now, since we have not yet reached a point where human space settlement exists, we still have work to do.
Absolutely. And I think that I think most folks listening to our shows are going to agree that there's, we're close, right? We've seen, we can say with a straight face that there's half a dozen legit, well-funded, well-teamed, well-organized space station organizations out there, companies, right? But is 6 enough to move humanity out into space? Probably not, right? It's a starting point, but it's a rowboat and there's an ocean ahead of us, right?
And the thing for folks to realize is that these things go in cycles, and we've seen it before, unfortunately.
Well, let's tease a little bit with our first guest, right? Why don't you talk about who it was, some insights. Don't spoil the show because we got a show to do. But
Right.
what I got some surprises out of that interview.
So we had the pleasure of speaking with Lori Garver, who was instrumental in this whole transformation, and not as a board member of the Space Frontier Foundation or something like that. So in some ways, she's not specifically a leader in the organization, but was absolutely a leader in the space arena in general. And the discussions, first of all,
Just for clarity, Lori Garver started as the executive assistant, secretary, bookkeeper,
back before the merger, NSI,
right, of the National Space Institute. And then over time became the executive director of the National Space Society, and then over time became the number 2 deputy administrator at NASA. So that is a long ways to climb over a 30-year career. So let's talk about Lori for a second. Why did we include her into the Pioneers show, and tease a little bit about what we got out of that?
So the why is because she was in the room when it happened, and if you haven't already read her story about her trials, and go read it, stop listening to this and go listen to that. The thing that I was interested in understanding was how she managed through the years of believing in this right answer for the future and then putting the time in to make it happen. So I forget if that has answered your question or not, but she is one of the key pieces, and she benefited from the community support that the foundation was able to offer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just posted the link to her book, Lori Garver, Escaping Gravity. Dr. Plata again, Doug is asking, would Sean be willing to predict when the very first off-Earth settlers will settle down and where? I'm going to, so when and where?
Nope.
Big chicken.
No, it has nothing to do with chicken. It has to do with, it wouldn't matter. Point estimates are for suckers, because there is no way to know that. There is certainly factors that can affect it, and I could give you, an over under. We could get into a betting game, but I'm going to go to an analogy that might answer why I'm not going to answer that question. A lot of times we think of companies like the factory, where you have a building with machines and people that come in and they turn a crank and you have a reliable product that comes out. And that is not the way startups are. And frankly, it's not the way a lot of businesses are. The better analogy is the farmer who has skills and knows there's a lot of things that need to get done. But you don't know what you're doing today until you get up and see what the weather is. And it doesn't matter what the weather prediction is. It matters what the weather is. And so whether your crop is going to be brought in on the 15th or the 28th, it doesn't necessarily matter. And the weather is outside your control. So sometimes it's not going to come in when you expect it to. So that's my big explanation for why I'm not going to give you a specific. It's a wicked problem that has way too many interacting nodes. But what we can do is we can say, what are some of the things that we expect will happen on our way to that point? And so understanding that those conditions, those gates, things that need to happen is where I've spent more of my energy. So sorry, Doug, not trying to be too much of a smart aleck, but
I have put my stake in this for a long time, so I don't have any problems with it. A lot's going to happen on Mars, but Mars is not going to be the first settlement site. It just isn't. There's a lot that has to happen. It will be a settlement site, but it won't be the first, and it probably won't be the biggest. The moon has the most current activity, but no one currently is expecting anything larger than an Antarctic-style settlement. So that will be, but my definition for settlement starts with babies. If you can't have babies, you're just camping.
Yep.
Right? You're not a settler until you can have kids. And for me, that means it's space station. For me, I'm back to the original O'Neill question, space stations. And because we already have several under development, they're getting more and more money along the way, even though they haven't actually achieved it. My bet is space stations. So that's where I plant my flag. But it's going to be stations first, Mars, Moon second, Mars third, and then the rest of the asteroids. That's with my stake. Yeah.
And the thing that we need before there are babies, you're right.
Yep.
We need real economic value that can only be produced in space.
Yep.
And
we don't have it yet.
We do not. I understand there's phenomenal things that we've done, and Tang and Velcro and space telescopes and all the rest of that. We are not yet. There are some things that create value from space. Communication and observation is where that is right now. When we get to something that is manufactured and only able to be manufactured in, or only economically manufactured in space, that is not for the space industry.
Right.
Then we will have the economic engine that will drive us to want to have space stations and more permanent settlements. And then eventually people will say, hey, instead of flying back and forth, how about I just drop roots here?
Yeah. Yeah. So I hate to say it, but I think it's a long ways away. I think we're going to do a lot of camping before we have settlement. But I don't think it's 50 years. I think it's 15, right? And I feel somewhat. There's going to be a kid born in space before 15 years though. I am 100% sure that the first kid, even if they are a science experiment, the first kid in space will happen before 15. It will be the ultimate national pride element, and it might be a citizen of the Principality of Luxembourg. It might be a royal prince from United Arab Emirates. It's probably not going to be an American. It's probably not going to be a European, although it's going to be a European company that probably makes it happen. So that's me with my crystal ball. All right, we've only got 20 minutes. This has been a super fast 40 minutes here. So we've got some other topics. What do you want to talk about ISTC, and what did you learn both as a fan and a nerd, and then what did you get as a pro in your role?
So one of the things that I've been doing, along with board and other members, other advocates, is this process of not just, hey, this is an important tactical thing to do, but making sure we're taking the time to step back, look at what does the landscape look like, and not just say, oh well, such and such an organization doesn't know what they're doing, or like let's actually test some of our assumptions. And so part of that process has been soliciting input from advocates and other thought leaders. And I was fortunate that the folks that were running ISDC had said, hey, so National Space Society was more than happy to give us the opportunity for the Space Frontier Foundation to have a breakout workshop. And this was great because it allowed me to get the conversation out of the one-on-one and actually have a group. And so that group walked through the kind of the overview that I've mentioned here, kind of how do we assess the rest of the world, and what are the gaps? What are the things that the future of space, that advancing human settlement of space, what are the things that might be opportunities and threats? What are those things that are kind of over the horizon? And out of it, we came up with, there were 4 different items that kind of bubbled up as meeting the criteria of good to do, someone else is not doing it, and the foundation may be well suited to address. And the first one came a little bit more out of avoidance of a problem, but public acceptance of space settlement was one of the things that we had come up as a concern, as some pundits may want to, complain about billionaires in space or misrepresent what is actually going on in the public discourse. And to a certain degree, companies don't really have the interest in picking a fight with internet trolls, and no one in the government, either civil servant or elected, is going to want to poke that sort of thing. So one of the things that we believe should be done, and we may be able to make a serious contribution towards, is providing better information and better persuasive arguments about the benefits of space, not about how cool space is.
Right.
There's plenty of space is cool. What the connection of how space is actually helping improve the human condition is one of those things.
Right. The Billionaire Boys Club, and by the way, I did some research a couple of years ago. I counted 19 billionaire boys and 1 woman. And there's a wild card in there also. Anusha Ansari is not a billionaire, but she certainly deserves to be on one of the big funding lists, even though she, quote, only put 10 million in. But it's 19 to 1, and that ratio is not changing. So that by itself it's a problem. It's a problem with the industry and how it has been represented. And I'm a fan of Blue, and I'm a fan of SpaceX. Not necessarily am I a fan of their bosses and how they present themselves in the world, right? So you have this public perception, and then we always, for the last 20 years that I've been in this game, almost 25 years, if we can't afford, another school, why are we building a space shuttle, right? If we can't afford, why can't we solve problems on the ground before we go to space? Well, we can't solve all the problems on the ground, and I know all the answers, but we in the industry are terrible at telling our story, right? We're so bad at it. So, all right, so that was one of the things. That was one of the takeaways.
That's one for an audience that is kind of external to the industry. Right. The second external audience is exporting the value that space can provide to other industries. And so what this piece would look like is training and having advocates, members of the Space Frontier Foundation, actively seeking out speaking opportunities at other industry groups, whether it's local organizations all the way up to national conferences. Mm-hmm. Not to say, do you remember how cool space was when you were a kid? Well, it's still cool, come work here. But rather to say, there are benefits that space can provide that you are missing.
Right.
And so come learn how, space is not like it was in the 60s. And there is still an awful lot of people that are thrilled about space, but as soon as they go to work, that's something that's cool, but not real in terms of part of my business. And so it's my objective that every company would have at least 15 minutes of what's going on in space as part of their strategic quarterly meeting. Just as you would have for, hey, what are the developments in the internet 20 years ago?
Right.
If you're not thinking about it, then you're not going to be able to act when those things are available. So that's kind of those are the two kind of outside audiences. One is a general audience and the other is focused at different industry verticals. On the inside, it's two pieces. It's the incoming folks that are coming into the industry. And as people are joining this burgeoning industry, what sort of welcome is being provided now by the industry, right? Companies have their welcome kit, but there is something to be said for connecting people as they come into the industry workforce, that they are not just part of a company, but they're part of an industry, part of a community. And so that's one part of the audience. And to a certain degree, that Pioneers podcast is speaking to kind of be part of the welcome kit. And then the other part of that is for those that are in the industry, for the leaders, for the doers, for the people that are in it and need from time to time a home, a place to go to where people are familiar with the challenges that you're encountering. Because the Space Frontier Foundation for me was home. Yep. I have phenomenal friends in other industries, and occasionally we'll have conversations where they'll be, oh, did you think of that? Great. But when push comes to shove, and I want someone who knows the sorts of things that I was grappling with, having that community is really important. So that fourth audience there is the doers, and this is about elevating our level of performance, elevating how we as the people that are working in this industry get better. Because we cannot just say, oh, well, we're here, we're now doing it, I'm now working at a company. No, that's just the ante. We need to do more. We need to do better. We need to support those that are coming along. And as an industry, we need to be improving ourselves and how we lead the industry. So those are the four things that kind of had come out of the conversation. And they're not necessarily brand new themes, but it was interesting to hear each of those identified as we were talking about what are the things that can help move us forward or slow our progress. Each of those four came up. So now I'm charting this in and trying to answer the question. The next piece is, as we have these different candidates of how we will focus our energy, is it a sustainable model? And do we have a sustainable funding model that will match it? Because just because there's a work that needs to be done,
right, doesn't mean you can afford to do it.
Got the case that closes.
Right.
And one of the other things we've been trying to make sure that we're doing is we're pulling best practices for nonprofit management and implementing that. And that sounds terribly boring, but that's how an organization can be successful.
Right.
And it's for the Space Frontier Foundation. This is our next step. In order for us to have the sort of impact that we want to have to advance human settlement in space, this is the thing we need to do.
It's a 35-year-old organization that has had a, let's say, bumpy and colorful existence. Successful, no question. It has influenced some pretty important elements, but now it's time to grow up a little bit and kind of take that necessary next step. And I think it's great. I think it's candidly it's overdue. As an advocate myself, I've wondered what the next step was. So I think it's great that y'all are doing that and have that also that economic focus, because this show is about the money of space, and every bit of it matters.
And the idea that nonprofit means don't make money, it doesn't work.
No.
And I am much broader than I am deep. And so there's a lot of the space industry that I still don't know. But as a counterpoint, I spend time in other industries, and the trap of nonprofits trying to get by with a skinny budget and a bunch of volunteers is a trap that many nonprofits, not just in the space world, but all over, fall into, because it makes such perfect sense and it avoids the having to ask people for money.
Right.
And so great, let's just do that. The difficulty is you then wind up repeating the exact same lessons with new volunteers over and over and over again.
Right.
So let's escape that cycle.
Okay, that's good. So ISDC, International Space Development Conference, National Space Society, they hosted each year. What were some of the takeaways, that you personally experienced? I for those who haven't gone, I refer to, and I've heard that somebody else came up with this phrase, but I really appreciated it and kept it. Somebody else said it was the family reunion of space. And for me, it's the only place in the industry where grandmothers can bring their granddaughters and be excited about this thing we call space, right? And so, yes, that's definitely a component. And there's a family, junior high, high school, even middle school component to it. And that's really important. I'm not taking anything away from that. I love that. But also it's a place where the pros hang out in the back of the room, or at the hotel lobby, or at the hotel bar, or at the pizza place across the street, and we become friends. And in that friendship, that ad hoc informal network starts to form, and in those relationships, companies and policies and movements are born. So I'm a big fan of the National Space Society. I've been I used to go absolutely every year. It's been about 3 years since I've gone. But some of the biggest connections I've made, some of them are giant connections I've made at the National Space Society, including the guest we were just talking about, the deputy administrator of NASA. So yeah, I'm a big fan. So you go there, from a professional perspective. What's it like for you? What was it like this year? I think this is the first one they've had in person for several years because of the pandemic.
Yeah, and this was the first time that I've attended, as far as I rightly recall. And the first impression was, wow, there are an awful lot.
That's interesting coming from Maston, because Carmack was a regular. He was a regular. Yep. John Carmack was a regular at ISDC. That's when I first encountered him. I assumed you had gone before.
Founder of Armadillo. And I talked to Neil Milburn, who had been part of the Armadillo team and then was there with EXO. So yes, so we even talked about him. But there were other folks that covered that conference, and it just was not one of the ones that was the one that I had to be at in my Maston role. But there were tremendous number of young folks, students. There were various student competitions. I got to sit in and be a judge for the space-based solar power set of presentations, which were pretty cool. I picked some things up from listening to those student presentations, and I think I was actually also able to offer a few suggestions for them as they move forward. So it was a lot of folks, and so there was both the younger folks, but then there's also, and maybe just because I know I've come to know who some of the people are, I can know looking around, there are people in the room or at that conference that have many, many, many decades of experience and have already lived through so many of these things. So a great wide swath of folks. I heard a presentation about why the FCC should be the home of the one-stop shop for novel space. At first, I was like, I'm not sure I'm going to agree with this, but then there were some really good points that were made. Yeah. So it was interesting to me because there was a lot of people that are partially involved in the industry, perhaps, that were bringing perspectives that were new. So it wasn't the tactical down in the weeds. How do we go ahead and get this policy pushed forward? It was, hey, here's policy. Here's an outside perspective or a quasi outside perspective about how to move us forward in our national space policy. And the National Space Society is also kind of bought in to the O'Neillian version of the future.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to tell you a quick story. This would have been maybe 2009, 2010. My company at that point had closed, right? Liftport had closed at that point. And I'm not in the speaking circuit the way I used to be. But I was invited to ISCC, so I went. And I'm giving this lecture about the space elevator. And I just moved away from the Earth elevator and focusing on the lunar elevator at the time. So it's relatively new for me. And I describe how it works and I describe why. And one of the things is to build out space-based solar power, because I think that's one of the drivers that's going to drive the industry of space. and using lunar resources to build that system. So that's the context, right? And then my presentation is over and I'm getting off stage. And the way I always operate is whoever is the youngest person in the audience, that's the person I answer the question first, right? So lots of kids there. And then as I answer more questions, I start talking to older and older people. There's this one gray-haired old man, kind of crumpled down, long silver hair, short, and there's a whole community of Indians. This year, there were like hundreds of Indian kids that had flown over for this event, right? It was really cool. So I'm like, okay, answering. And this old guy, he knows what I'm doing. He can see, this kid, right? And he's being super patient. And me, I'm thinking, professor, maybe a supervisor for the kid, a chaperone for all the kids, maybe a high school teacher, but he's kind of older, so I'm thinking professor. So he's being patient as I'm answering these younger kids and progressively older. Yeah, he was the president of India. He was President Kalam. And I made him wait almost 10, 15 minutes. And he was, nodding and eye contact and curious and listening to all of my answers. I had absolutely no idea who he was. I answered his question. He was really interested in space-based solar power. At that point, he was retired and he was the administrator of NASA's, India's equivalent of NASA, OSSI, I forget what it's called. Anyway, so he's the president, he's the director of the Indian equivalent of NASA. And I made him wait like 10, 15 minutes before I answered his question, shook his hand and walked away. And people were like, oh my God, what was that like? I'm like, what do you mean, what was it like? I had no idea. And I never saw him again. I never had a chance to go up and talk to him after that. So that was my one shot. So that's what ISDC to me is.
Never know.
You never know, right? You never know. All right. Hey, Sean, with that, we're going to close up. It's been a very fast hour. I really appreciate both you being on the show, first time, second time, third time, that has led to a professional relationship with the Space Frontier Foundation and the new show, the Pioneers program. It's going to be great. So thanks a lot. We're really looking forward to how this plays out.
My pleasure.
All right. Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.